Our first guest is Warren Reed. Warren is the author of The Lyncher and Me, A Search for Redemption in the Face of History. It's a memoir he wrote after his shocking discovery that his great-grandfather was a central figure responsible for the lynching in Duluth of Elias Clayton, Elmer Jackson, and Isaac McGhie. It's also the story of finding healing, particularly from those connected to the victims of his ancestors' horrific crime. Thank you for being here tonight, Warren.
Thank you for having me.
So yours is an extraordinary story. You were doing basic research on your family's history, and this was pretty much the early days of the internet, and your great-grandfather's name popped up. Tell me what that was like and what you found.
Well, I had been really just focused on family tree information, trying to get a sense of who my ancestors were, and certainly didn't expect to find out anything notable. But one night I happened to do a search on my great-grandfather's, on my mother's maiden name, Dondino, and an article came up that outlined the lynchings in 1920 Duluth. And I didn't see his name right away, but I knew that it had come up for some reason. And what I remember is when I saw his name as one of the key people that led the mob down to the jail. My first impulse was to try to explain it away as a coincidence, that it couldn't possibly be him. But it didn't take long for me to realize. I mean, it's an unusual name, and the age was right, and the location was right. So it was shocking, to say the least, for sure.
Right. This article was the article by Heidi Bach Hansen in the short-lived alternative paper, The Ripsaw, in about 2000. And for those who don't know, I want to quickly go through the story of the lynching, which is that the men lynched were three black traveling circus workers. They were accused of raping 19-year-old Irene Tuscan from West Duluth. And as I always tell the story, I have to quote the doctor who examined her the very next day and said that there was no sign of sexual assault. So the accusation was that there were actually 6 black circus workers that allegedly raped her. 3 men were taken from the Old City Jail in Duluth and hung from a lamppost at 1st Street and 2nd Avenue East. And there were as many as 10,000 people in the crowd. So when you search for information about them 80 years later, when you search for information about your family, rather, 80 years later, you came up largely blank except for one fine, and we discussed that part. So, well, what did you find out about the victims of the crime?
Well, I didn't find out anything for quite a while. My initial response when I went through was really just trying to reconcile what we knew about or what we believed about my great-grandfather and my mother's relationship with him, and really kind of what that meant for our family and how we could support the memorial that they were doing in Duluth to the 3 men that were lynched. It wasn't until after that I really was pushed to see what I could find out about the men who were lynched. And I didn't really expect to find anything because people had looked for quite a while. But then, like you said earlier, it was the early days of the internet. And so more and more things were suddenly being found online. And eventually I found that Elmer Jackson, one of the men who was lynched, was born in a freed slave settlement in Missouri, a town called Pennytown. And coincidentally enough, there were descendants of the people who lived there who still gathered every year. And so that was an opportunity for me to see if I could connect with someone from his family.
Mm-hmm. And what was their reaction when you did make that connection? How did you make that connection?
Well, it was a very kind of odd series of events that actually made that connection. And just taking a little bit of information from Elmer Jackson's death certificate, I was able to do some census research and see the names of the people in his family. And then coincidentally, there is an old church on the site of the freed slave settlement that's in the historical register. And the article about that online actually had a snapshot of Elmer Jackson's family as one of the people who lived here. And that was really odd because they had, over 40 families that lived there, and this was a family they highlighted. So that really provided that connection. And through that, I connected with a woman named Virginia Houston, who is the caretaker of that church and the project. And I reached out to her by email first to just kind of let her know our story and what I'd learned about Elmer. And she was very gracious and interested in the history of it. And from there, we talked on the phone, and I went there to visit, and we've become very good friends.
Right.
And as we've gone through, yeah,
Sure.
we actually found that she is an offshoot relative of Elmer Jackson, as a matter of fact.
We're just looking at a picture of the two of you at the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, the opening of it actually 2 years ago in Montgomery, Alabama. And this is also informally known as the National Lynching Memorial. But you've met a few times before, and in fact, you give presentations together.
Yeah, she like I said, she's been wonderfully gracious, and I don't know what I would have done if our paths hadn't crossed. It was a lot for us to figure out as a family. It was a lot for me to figure out as a parent, as a descendant of someone who did something like this. Um, and I just remember at the time, my initial emotion was just overwhelming guilt, but no real explanation about that guilt because obviously I wasn't there when it happened. But she was just really generous and understanding, and really kind of walked alongside me as our friendship grew, to help me kind of process this. And I know she's come to Duluth with me to see the memorial, and then to be able to see the national memorial was really powerful to be able to do that with her.
And to give people an idea just how much she does, I think I have to say the word treasures you. When I met the two of you at the National Memorial, she referred to you as her baby brother.
She does. Yeah, I love her dearly. She's an amazing person.
Right. Did you ever imagine a relationship like that would happen when you sent that email in the first place?
No, not at all. And I really didn't have any idea of how she would even respond. I found the old emails, and I was kind of amused at how very businesslike they were between she and me. And Because I think I was just wanting to give her the information. I didn't really know I like how I was supposed to feel, or what I was even really wanting from her. Um, and like I said, she was very polite and very receptive. And it wasn't until later when we talked on the phone that the warmth really started to come up between us. And um, she acknowledged that this is a part of history that's very real and very ugly. And she and I are on the same page in the sense that there's nothing we can do about what's already happened, but we have a responsibility as humans to try to change the course
Right.
of what's happening.
Our focus tonight on Focus is art as a response to racism. So writing emails is one thing, talking on the phone, but you decided to write a whole book on this, and I also take it you're not completely done on that artistic endeavor, but you got the book out as we've introduced
Yeah.
it, The Lyncher and Me. What was that process like? And I assume a catharsis, but can you ever really achieve something like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's definitely been a journey. It's been an evolution, and I think about where I was at the time that I wrote it and where I am now. It's a bit different. I think at the time, really, I was like kind of going through a jungle trying to figure out, what this meant about our family. It was really a way to kind of turn things inside out and take a closer look at us as a family. And I look at it from the standpoint of this event in 1920 was like a wound, and a lot of people tried to keep it covered and not acknowledge it. And we know that if you do that, a wound doesn't have a chance to heal. And so a lot of my writing process was looking at a couple of different things, looking at how did this wound impact my family through the generations. the choices that people made, the poison that happens when people just don't talk about things and try to keep them hidden, and how that just infects relationships. There was that piece. And then also that realization of, here was this man that my mother idolized. I didn't know him. I heard lots of stories about him growing up, and here's this very ugly truth about him and what he did. And it was that realization that there's no real black and white as far as like all evil and all good, that
In
we're
all
all shaped.
people, right, right.
Yes, yeah, that we're
So
all.
I want to go back to, and we'll have people read the book and find out more about your great grandfather. But as far as you particularly are concerned, and again, until Heidi Bach Hansen wrote the article in 2000, the names Irene Tuscan, Jimmy Sullivan, her boyfriend, were all hidden. And Dondino's not a usual name. It's not in Duluth anymore. You live in the Seattle area. You could have ignored this. On the other hand, the Tuscan family includes Mike Tuscan, who is now our chief of police, who, the irony is you are more of a direct descendant of Dondino, and Mike is more indirect. That was his great aunt. So how do you reconcile, or can you reconcile, or did you have a responsibility, do you feel, to claim this? You could have easily walked away. And there we have a picture of the three of you, Mike, Virginia, and yourself. Very quickly.
Yeah. I think I definitely could have just ignored it or dealt with it just within our family. I think if I came across the story and it was just an article I dug up and there was nothing else about it, we would have dealt with it as a family. But the fact that the community was building this memorial that I knew probably was at least a little controversial, that was really, I think, the impetus to get us more involved and stand behind it.
And you rose to the occasion. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Warren Reed, the author of The Lyncher and Me.